think some of these younger couples have been going down there, but not everybody that goes down there is necessarily young.
Good morning, church family, and Happy New Year. Hope you've had a great one so far. Despite the last night, anyone had any damage based on the weather last night? Good news, good news. Well, for quite a while now, we have been doing a comparison of the four Gospels. Scott? Oh. I think we got both speakers on. I may be wrong, but are both mics on? Is what? No? Well, okay. We've been looking or doing a comparison of the four Gospels, looking at them side by side, trying to glean whatever information we can out of both a comparison of what they've all recorded together and what others were inspired to write when the others were not. We've come a long way. We are in the last week. Last week we were with Jesus. He was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples. And it was early morning on Friday. And my notation there says light, and there was a question on it last week, so I want to remind you what my notations are. The light and night are there to indicate, light indicates that it's after midnight, not necessarily that it's light outside, because between midnight and 6 o'clock it is dark, but that it's after midnight, so that starts a new Roman day, but not a new Jewish day. And the night is there to indicate that it's after sunset, and that starts a new Jewish day. So Jewish days start at roughly 6 o'clock in the evening, whereas a Roman day starts at midnight. So Aviv 15, according to one of the calendars, it is now the festival of unleavened bread has begun. And according to the other calendar, the 14th, it is the day that the Passover lamb is going to be killed. So that's where we were last week. This week it's the same time frame. Jesus is still in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus' prayers have been concluded. So the action, if you will, is now about to begin. So the next event is Jesus is arrested. And it is recorded by all four gospel authors. And as we've done in the past, it has not too frequently, but as we've done in the past, whenever John writes about an event that the other three authors have written about, he's got some special insight into that event that the others didn't include. So when we get to John's portion there, look for what's different in his gospel that was not included in the other gospels. John was inspired to, he had 30 years to think about it, and God inspired him to include things that the others did not include. Now, Mark, Matthew's, and Luke's account are very similar, yet in each case, they've added a detail that the other ones have omitted. So we'll look at that carefully. John's account has come from a completely different perspective, so we'll look at it separately after we've looked at the first three accounts. So this is a composite, if you will, of Mark, Matthew's, and Luke's account. If there's no underline, that means that that sentence or that thought was included in all three of the Gospels. If there's an underline, such as here, for example, then that is something, and I put in parentheses behind it, something that one or two of the authors have included, but another author has omitted. So we'll start off with a section that is in all three of the Gospels. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd. And then, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests. Mark and Matthew included that. For whatever reason, Luke did not include the part about the clubs. So chief priests and then teachers of the law, Mark included that. Remember, Mark is Jewish, but he's writing to a Gentile audience. But to him, teachers of the law was significant. And the elders of the people, Mark and Matthew included that. Luke did not. You could easily understand Luke being a Gentile, writing to a Gentile audience, that the Jewishness of the elders of the people wasn't important to him or his audience. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Jesus said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Mark and Matthew included that, and instead of that line, Luke writes, Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." And Matthew was the only one that recorded that line. And then all three of them recorded, "Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword." Now, when we get to John's version, you'll see that John mentions that that's Peter. But the three here just said one of his companions. Drew it out and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And then Matthew includes, "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? You may recall way back when we started the class, I talked about how Matthew was very good, very persistent at showing how Jesus fulfilled Scripture. And here is another example of how Matthew is pointing out that Jesus is fulfilling Scripture, which is important to his Jewish audience. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touches the man's ear and healed him. That was Luke. John has a similar line in it when we get to John. And then all three of them, in that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me." And then Mark and Matthew add, "But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. So Mark and Matthew, being Jewish authors, again, talk about how the writings of the prophets would be fulfilled. And then Luke, instead of including the part about the prophecies being fulfilled or scriptures being fulfilled, Luke writes, "But this is your hour when darkness reigns." And then Mark curiously adds this one little line that none of the other authors adds, and many scholars believe that he's talking about himself here. "A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind." Like I said, Mark's the only one that included that, and many scholars believe that he's referring to himself there. Now we're going to switch over and look at John's account. He's coming from a different perspective. In this case, if there's no underline, then what he has there is similar to what the other three authors have included. If it's underlined, take a special look at that, because this is the special insight he has that the other authors did not have and were not inspired to put in. So in common, so Judas came to the garden guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. That's similar to what Mark and Matthew had. And then this is part of his insight. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And the parentheses are in the text, it's not mine. "And Judas the traitor was standing there with him," parentheses closed. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." And John inserts here, "This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me." So that is some insight that he had on this that the others did not. Then Simon Peter, John's the only one to name him specifically, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So John's the only one that names the soldier who had his ear cut off. That's important because a little bit later we're going to see a connection to Malchus. So watch out for it a bit later today. And then in common, Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. So Jesus is now arrested. Next event is Jesus is taken to the house of the high priest. I say that a little bit in tongue-in-cheek because when we get to John, we'll find out that there was one step before this, but we'll get over that. We'll get into that in just a second. So again, this was recorded by all four gospel authors, and again, when John includes something, look out for any special insight that he may have had. According to Mark, they took Jesus to the high priest. According to Matthew, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Luke, then seizing him, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. But when we get to John, we find out that John adds a detail that the others did not. And brought him first to Annas, or Ananias, as it's sometimes pronounced, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. A couple of things there. First off, in the beginning of the class when we were talking about Luke chapter 3, I think it was, Luke talks about Ananias and Caiaphas, and we talked about then that Ananias was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Caiaphas married Ananias' daughter. Ananias was at one point the chief priest. He was removed by the Roman proconsul and put his son in place. And in fact, Ananias had, I think it was 4 sons and a son-in-law, all of which had become high priest. But Ananias maintained, if you will, the control of the office while his sons or son-in-law were actually holding the position. So Luke actually called them high priests back in chapter 3 when he described them. John doesn't do that here, but he lets you know that Ananias is really in control here, and Jesus is taken to his house first. Second thing was, John is indicating here that Caiaphas already had a huge bias towards Jesus. He's pointing out here, Caiaphas was the one who said that someone needed to die for the good of the people. And so at this point, it doesn't look good for Jesus. So this next part is John is the only one that includes this next piece, because John's the only one that talked about Jesus going to Ananias' house. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I have always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Ananias sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. We'll pause here for a second. Last week during the sermon, Terry mentioned that this trial that Jesus had, and we're about to see that later today, was an illegal trial. And in many ways, it was very illegal. It did not conform to Jewish law. And this is one of those places here where it didn't conform. In order to convict anyone of anything, you needed to have 2 witnesses to testify, and those 2 witnesses needed to be consistent. They can't conflict with each other. And so John points out that Jesus is describing here, if you've got witnesses, bring them on. But you're accusing me of something. I've spoken openly. There should be many witnesses, and you've got none. I'll get to some of the other points on how it was an illegal trial when we get there. So at this point, Peter denies knowing Jesus. You remember last week, Jesus predicted to Peter that you will deny me 3 times tonight before the rooster crows. And it's about to happen here. Now, this was recorded by all 4 gospel authors again. Mark and Matthew's accounts are nearly identical. Luke's account is the most complete. And in John's account of Peter denying knowing Jesus is actually split into 2 sections. There's the first piece of it, then we'll have a part of the questioning, if you will, and then there'll be the third denial in John's piece. So we'll look at those. Well, actually, we're going to look at them together. I created a table for this one so that we can do a comparison of the event. And I think we're going to find it's extremely similar. It's very similar. So in the event, there is an accuser that accuses Peter of knowing who Jesus is. And in Matthew describes it as a servant girl. In Mark, he describes it as one of the servant girls. So we know that there are several servant girls there, and Mark tells us it's one of them. So far, he's consistent with Matthew. Luke also describes it as a servant girl, and John, in English, it comes out as the servant girl. Now, I want to caution you that in the Greek, there is no word for "the" in the Greek. So when the English translators translated it, John, they inserted the word "the" there, hopefully to make it clearer to us. But what I want to point out here is don't make a big issue of that here, because there is no "the" in the Greek. So it comes out as servant girl, a servant girl, one of the servant girls, and a servant girl. They're all very consistent with each other. Next is the place of the first denial. In Mark, he says it's the courtyard. Matthew also says it's the court. Well, actually, all 4 of them say it's the courtyard. This is the courtyard in the house of the high priest. Then there's a second accuser saying that, oh, you know that, Jesus. You're one of his disciples, right? And in Mark, it is the servant girl. Again, I want to caution you about the "the" there. Matthew says it's another servant girl. So not the same as the first. It's a second servant girl. Luke says it's somebody else. And John says they, one of the others, if you will. So again, very consistent. The place of the second denial, Mark has entryway and Mark has gateway, which is pretty much the same thing, and again, subject to translation. Luke and John don't state exactly where the second denial occurred. So again, all of these are very consistent with each other. Some of them they all describe a time period between the second and third denial. So it didn't occur immediately. There was some time period in between. Matthew says after a little while, which Matthew used the same phrase. Luke goes about an hour later, and John goes, meanwhile. So while other things were going along, meanwhile, this is also going along. Continuing the comparison. So then we have the third accuser, because remember there were 3 denials. And, are you one of his disciples? According to Mark, it was those standing there, and Matthew uses the same phrase. Luke says another asserted, so perhaps a third person. This is why I asked you to remember Malchus. John is very specific about who this third accuser is. It is a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off. So if you're a relative of Malchus and you recognize that Peter's the one that chopped off your relative's ear, you're going to recognize Peter an hour or 2 later when he's standing in the courtyard of the high priest. And so that's a detail John adds that the others did not. And so what is Peter's response? According to Mark, he called down curses and denied. So when we know we're in the wrong, how often do we say, yep, that was me, or how often do we strongly deny it? In this case, Peter strongly denied it. Matthew's was identical, called down curses and denial. Luke and John both just says he denied it. And then did the rooster crow? Yes. According to Mark, it crowed twice. Yes in Luke, and yes in John. And then something that Luke adds that the other three do not add is that right after the rooster crowed, there's this episode that you can visualize with Luke where the rooster crows and Jesus looks out into the courtyard and he looks eyeball to Peter, and you can almost hear the mental thought, I told you so. And at that point, Peter's response is he weeps. He goes out. He can't even stay there. He goes out and weeps. He broke down and wept. He went outside and wept. John doesn't state what Peter's response is at this point. Any questions before we move on? Okay. So now he's been questioned by Ananias, the father of the high priest. He's been questioned now by Caiaphas. Caiaphas wraps him up and sends him out to the Sanhedrin. Now, I mentioned that there was lots of ways this trial was illegal. This is another one coming up here. In Jewish law, in the first century, if there was going to be a death penalty, which, by the way, they couldn't enact the death penalty without the Romans. They didn't have the authority to do that. But if death penalty was going to be asserted, that trial had to be broken down into two phases. The first phase to determine guilt, and then there had to be a minimum of one night in between the guilt phase and the sentencing phase, and that allows everyone's head to calm down, cool down before you sentence a person, particularly if it's going to be for death. That did not happen here, and you can watch for that. Mark and Matthew's accounts are nearly identical. Luke's account is consistent with Mark and Matthew's, but it is abbreviated. It's much shorter. And Luke omits three details here. He doesn't include the details about Peter following Jesus, but where the other two do. He doesn't include the details of the false witnesses, and he did not include the descriptions of the physical abuse that Jesus took during this trial. By the way, physical abuse during the trial was not part of Jewish law either. So, Luke gives us a sense of the timing here, because remember, up until this point, it's wee hours of the morning and it's still dark. The rooster just crowed, and Luke then tells us at daybreak. So the sun is now coming up. The council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. This whole section here is Mark and Matthew only. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. So remember, there had to be two witnesses, and their statements needed to be consistent with each other. Mark and Matthew were telling you right here, their accounts did not agree with each other. Then the high priest asked him, "Are you not going to answer?" "What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. And then all three of them say, "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." And then Mark and Matthew insert, "The high priest tore his clothes." High priest tearing his clothes is a very Jewish thing. So you would expect the two Jewish authors to include that. For Luke, writing to his Gentile audience, he did not include that part. Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." And then Mark and Matthew include this at the end. They all condemned him as worthy of death. So remember, there's supposed to be two phases in a Jewish trial, and we're still in phase one, but they've already determined what the sentence is. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" Meanwhile, while all that's going on, Matthew writes this one little insert here. None of the other authors included that. But there's a lot of Jewish prophecy here to be fulfilled. Matthew wants to make sure you understand that prophecy is being fulfilled. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money." It was also against the law to give an illegal trial, but they weren't so concerned about that. They are concerned about putting 30 pieces of silver into the treasury, though. So Matthew continues, "So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me." Now, before I change the slide, no, I should have changed the slide already. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. Turns out that this phrase that he quotes is from Zechariah, not Jeremiah. However, Jeremiah is the first one who writes about the 30 pieces of silver and the potter. Let's look at the next slide, and then I'll come back to this. So in Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 and 13, "I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me the 30 pieces of silver, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they valued me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter at the house of the Lord." So at this point, you may or may not be scratching your head saying, okay, why did Matthew quote or say that this quote is from Jeremiah, but yet it's obviously from Zechariah? Is this an error? Surely not, right? There are several possibilities here. I'm not going to pinpoint and say it's absolutely this possibility, but from my perspective, if there's at least one possibility, then the text is not in error. It's just in our understanding of that text. So four possibilities. The first one. Although most ancient manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel, which is written in Greek, included an abbreviation form of Jeremiah. By the way, if you look at the King James Version, it doesn't say Jeremiah, it says Jeremy. Jeremy, when written in the ancient Greek, is an abbreviated form of Jeremiah. And that was translated into, it says Jeremy in King James Version. That was, the abbreviated form of Jeremiah was translated into Jeremy into the King James Version. In many of the other English versions, it does say Jeremiah. In any event, included an abbreviated form of Jeremiah, let me back up. Although most ancient manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel in Greek included the abbreviated form of Jeremiah, some just say the prophet. So in some manuscripts, it doesn't list Jeremiah or Zechariah, it just says, quoted by the prophet. And so it's very possible that the original manuscript just said the prophet, and someone at some other later point inserted Jeremy. So that's one possibility. However, there are other manuscripts that actually say the prophet Zechariah. So another possibility is that the original did say Zechariah, and someone mistranslated that into Jeremiah. So that's one possibility. I mentioned that in the manuscript it's the abbreviated form of Jeremiah. So the second possibility is, in Greek, the abbreviated forms of Jeremiah and Zechariah are very similar to each other, with only the first letter being different. That letter being the difference between an I, the Greek I, and the Greek Z, or zeta. And when you look at handwriting with a capital I or a capital Z, the I and the Z can easily be misread. You could easily see the Z and think it's an I. So in those handwritten manuscripts, they saw the abbreviated form for Zechariah and thought it was Jeremiah, and mistranslated it into Jeremiah. So that's a possibility. Third possibility is that, remember, we're talking about the Jewish scriptures here. And the way the Jewish scriptures are organized, they're organized in three parts. There is the law, which we've talked about, the first 5 books, the books that Moses wrote, the Torah, the law. The second one is the prophets. And the third piece is the sacred writings. Now, the first book in the minor prophets section of the Jewish prophets is Jeremiah. So it's very common in the first century that when you're talking about the books of the prophets, that you refer to the first book, and that book would have been Jeremiah. Yes, Terry?
It's really important for people to remember that translations are not inspired.
Exactly.
Manuscripts are inspired.
The original manuscript was inspired.
And
The copies were not.
The accuracy that we have in the Bible is by comparison of all of the manuscripts to see what is the most prevailing and the most likely of what the original had said.
Roger that, every word of it. And when you take a look at the accuracy of those transcriptions, they're highly accurate. It's 99.5%, I believe. Very few errors in transcription, but there are some. And but they're in transcription, they're not in the original text. So we talked about the three parts of the Jewish scriptures, the law, the prophets, and the sacred writings. Jeremiah being the first book into the prophets, and it was common practice to refer to the entire work of the prophets by the first book, which was Jeremiah. So Matthew could have been referring to the work that was in the prophets by using the term Jeremiah. Now, is there any evidence that that ever happened? And in fact, yes, there is. Luke records an instance where Jesus does exactly the same thing. In Luke 24:44, Jesus uses the phrase, the law, the prophets, and instead of saying the sacred writings, he uses the word psalms to describe prophecies that he had to fulfill. And clearly there are prophecies in the sacred writings other than the psalms that he fulfilled, but by using the word psalms, he's referring to all of the sacred writings, not just the literal book of the Psalms that we know today. So yeah, there's evidence that in first century Jewish people, when they talked about these books, often referred to the entire section by naming the first book. Now, the fourth possibility that's been written about is that Jeremiah wrote about 30 pieces of silver, and Jeremiah wrote about the potter. He just didn't use that particular phrase that Matthew quoted, that Zechariah quoted. So it's possible that that phrase that was quoted and recorded by Zechariah was spoken by Jeremiah, but just not recorded by Jeremiah. It was recorded later by Zechariah, and therefore Matthew, according to some Jewish tradition, would have known that and known that Jeremiah said it first. Zechariah was the one that recorded that. So there's at least four possibilities there of why Matthew might have used the word Jeremiah when the actual quote he used came from Zechariah. Any questions on that? Okay. Then we'll move on. I got time, I think, for one. Got time for one more event. So the Sanhedrin doing their illegal act, by the way, so if they decided that Jesus was guilty, then what should have happened was they all go home, have a good night's sleep, and the next day come back and determine what the sentence was going to be. That didn't happen here. They found him guilty and condemned him all in one setting, which was against Jewish law, making this an illegal trial as far as Jewish law was concerned. But even then, the Jews did not have the authority to enact the death penalty. They would have had to turn him over to the Romans to do that, and that's exactly what they did here. This slide, one more, and then I'll end. This is recorded by all four of the gospel authors. Mark and Matthew's was nearly identical. Very early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans on how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. In Luke's version, then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And in John's version, then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. And since the bell rang, I'll end it there, and we'll pick up here next week. Any questions or comments? No? Okay, thank you. Let's get ready for our worship.